Thank you all for having me today. I have to say it's always a pleasure to listen to Linda. She's got this tone that if she wanted to ever do ASMR, it'd be perfect. I would love it. On the other hand, I've been told I have a face for radio and a voice for print, so it'll probably be a little bit different, but I did want to invite everybody, and I know this is going to happen multiple times, but to be the first one to say ultimately thank you to Linda for putting this together. It's just a fantastic event. And a great opportunity to join to join forces to work together with the TCBAF and of course Best Buy in this facility. But Linda has given me an opportunity to talk a little bit about myself. I did not title this Unlearning or Confessions of a Slow Learner. But I would like to say to you that I learned my architecture on the streets. I rolled my sleeves up, I did it, and that would be a total and utter lie. It was the exact opposite of that. And I will tell you, my journey has been a journey of unlearning that when I started learning software architecture, it was actually in college. I went to school for a long, long time. I did a bachelor's in computer science, and then I did a master's in computer science, and then I went on to do another master's in computer science at another institution, and then I did my PhD also in computer science at Stanford. And then I taught architecture, I taught database design, then I did a postdoctoral fellowship because I didn't have enough. And that was with the CIA, so I had enough. But all along the way, I was basically learning formal methods. I was learning software design principles. I was learning about complexity, whether it was algorithmic complexity, big O notation, or the differences between RISC chips and CISC chips and Verilog hardware design, and ultimately all the things about how all of the pieces are put together. And what's interesting is by the time I was done with school, which did overlap my first startup, admittedly, I got distracted there for about an hour or two. I got my first real job, and my first real job, if you will, post-startup was actually at Yahoo, and it was at the turn of the century, and I was Yahoo's first architect. And so I wasn't the chief architect then, I was a principal architect, and we eventually had things like we had to have job families and career paths and all that sort of stuff. And when I joined the company, it felt huge at the time. It was 3,500 people, like 3,000 people at the same company. The largest company I'd ever worked at before was when our startup managed to get huge. We were at 80 people ultimately before we sold to HP. And it felt like a totally different world. However, I thought I knew what the job entailed. I thought I knew what it meant to be an architect. I had done all the things that should have certified me. I spent a lot of time on TOGAF. I was even one of the first certified Scrum Masters, again, at Yahoo. And so I kind of knew everything about the practice of architecture. Except that it turns out the practical lessons of what was really there weren't things that showed up in the classroom. The things that really judged success were not things that were part of the job description. And that ultimately I had to let go of a lot of things that I thought I knew to be successful at the practice of architecture. And so I'll talk about those things today, and ultimately what I think, personally, the two jobs of an architect are. My career journey was obviously this one. I started out as an architect. I graduated college in the 90s, and then again in the 90s, and then again in the 90s. And then the very last time when I finally submitted my dissertation, I actually graduated again in the 2000s because I was done with my research, but eventually had to submit something. So that took a little bit of time. But as I mentioned, my first job was architecture. My first love is architecture. It's oftentimes been told that it's difficult to be an architect on my team because I know too much about it, and I pick on those people and dig in, and it's something that I'm like to think of as my recovering architect. Eventually became a technology executive more broadly. And so I went through a transformation at Yahoo after being there for a number of years. I became chief architect in the consumer business. We had sort of three businesses: advertising, search, and consumer. And from there, I became vice president of engineering, and I run platform services. And I did that for a long time. And then eventually, I became what I think of as sort of business leader. And so not only ran a function within technology, but then ran technology, and then ultimately ran parts of P&L, different companies, that sort of thing. This is the framework for the talk today. Let's just pretend the world looks like this, that I started as an architect, became a tech executive, and then ultimately a sort of business leader. Reality was a little bit different, a little bit messier. It is sort of funny. Linda talked about the different companies that were there with the TCBAF over the years. And I have ties to most of them, strangely enough. So I was Chief Information Officer at Express Scripts for a while, a year and a half, I think. And then I became Chief Operating Officer. And then ultimately we sold that company to Cigna. And you'll find there are a couple of stories that feel like that. Most recently, I was at Walgreens working for actually my old CEO from Express Scripts. And then we sold that company to private equity. But along the way, I've had a lot of different jobs. So I have done the architecture thing. I have led technology. But I was also president at American Express. That my boss, while I was CIO, left to become CEO of PayPal. And they made the grave mistake of saying, hey, tech guy, let's have you take this job. And so I've run a lot of different things, and it's given me a lot of different perspectives. And what I would tell you is that this journey led me to a very different place in my thinking about what architecture actually meant and what a successful architect should do and what their job ultimately should be. But before here, remember, I knew everything. I had all of the answers. I knew what architecture meant. I knew what the disciplines were. I knew those boxes and those delineations that Linda talked about, all of the lines around what it meant to be a business architect, a solutions architect, a technical architect, a chief architect. It didn't matter. I can tell you chapter and verse. And it took me a long time, again, a long time to realize that that actually didn't matter at all. So the most interesting time, though, the thing that I always think back to, that I think of as sort of the most fruitful, if you will, when I was an architect, was sort of my time at Yahoo. And a lot of interesting things happened there. And so, while we were there, it's funny, I think of this slide as imposter syndrome, like for me. It was really tough. When I was at Yahoo and I was chief architect, I had a really good team. They were kind of amazing. And I'd ask them to do something. And I'd say to Rasmus Lerdorf, hey, Rasmus, we've got architectural review board coming up. Are you going to make it? And Rasmus would say, no, I'm busy. Because Rasmus had invented PHP and wrote the runtime for it, and he was the sole maintainer. And at one point in time, 70% of all the traffic on the web ran on his little thing. So I was like, okay, I won't bother you. And so I would say, hey, Doug, Doug, multiple Dougs in this story, but I'd say, hey, Doug Crockford, can you make it to ARB? We've got to get this review together. And Doug would say, I don't know, kid. Not sure I have time. I got this thing JSON that I just invented that seems to be taken off, and I've got to work on the spec, and they're gonna have to find somebody else. And I'd say, okay, well, other Doug, Doug Cutting, can you help out? And he's like, oh man, we worked on Hadoop together, and I got a lot of time to really work on this thing, and so I can't make ARB. I was like, oh, malarkey. Who else can I call on? Oh, Mark Delaney. I'd say, Mark Delaney, can you make it to ARB this week? And he'd say, oh, I can't. I got this thing, it's called the DKIM standard, right? So domain keys. I'm keeping the world safe for internet, for email that's transmitted over the internet. And so what was interesting is somehow I was leading this team that I was convinced the entire time was utterly and absolutely far more capable than I ever was. You'll see the Apache traffic server, at least that had a few different contributors. It wasn't just one person on my team who knew everything in the world. But it was, kind of an amazing time. This is also the time at the internet where it was actually easy to be great because you were getting to make it up as you went, right? There was no cloud. There was no Bitcoin or distributed hash tables. We didn't worry about LLMs and AI and all the other things that we're going to see tracks on because we were making it up as we would go, right? So anybody ever heard of semi-structured data? Anybody? Ooh, not a lot of people. Oh, okay. Well, if you have, apparently it's a big deal. I've heard this. There's this paper over here, like a fast index for semi-structured data from B.F. Cooper, and the second author on that paper, because Brian was the smarter one, and he's still at Google, but it turns out it's me. And this was at the turn of the century, quite literally, some work that we did in the late 90s, and it's been cited, 700 times almost since then. It's sort of one of the foundational documents on how we actually index semi-structured data. Because before then, it was actually pretty easy. We didn't really care about document retrieval in the same sort of way. The internet wasn't nearly as interesting, and everything came down to structured data. It was about SQL, and it was about various other systems. But all along the way, I had these amazing experiences with these amazing people. And 99% of the time, I felt like an imposter, right? And so it was kind of interesting. And it was humbling at the same time. And I couldn't figure out what was I doing differently, that all these other people were able to do these things. And yet I was the guy who had a PhD in this stuff. I thought I knew what all the answers were, what all the boxes were, what all the boundaries were. And then maybe the last thing, like there's this book, Humanizing the Web, Change in Social Innovation. And just keep your hands up if you've heard of these people. So like Terry Winograd from Stanford, Hector Garcia Molina, Tim O'Reilly. Anybody heard of Tim O'Reilly? Katarina Fake, Reid Hoffman. Anybody? Jimmy Wales, Wikipedia, right? So a couple people. So this book is a survey of 19 internet luminaries, where they think things are going, where they think the evolution of the web is going to go, and then somehow me. Like they included me in there, and I was like, I just don't even understand why I'm in the same conversation with these people. But it was super awesome, so I bought the book and sent it to my mom, and she's maybe to this day the only other person who's read it outside of academia. So I came from a place of sort of knowing everything and understanding the formal methods and being an architect and wearing that as a badge of pride, to somebody who was utterly humbled, who felt like I was in this arena and literally everybody knew more about their own stuff and sometimes even my stuff than I did. So I had to kind of figure out what was wrong. And what I grew up with was this notion of modeling. And it didn't matter whether it was domain modeling or technical modeling. I grew up using things like rows and UML, and I did ER diagrams. Everything seemed to me like it was a model. And the thing that I had been taught in school for years and years and years was this, that ultimately, if I could model things precisely enough, that reality would follow. So the idea there, of course, is that, again, we start with our model, we start with our high-level problem definitions, our domains, we look to do solutions, we evaluate opportunities, and then we come up with the perfect plan, right? Or at least that's what I was taught. Because I was taught decomposition, I was taught modeling, I was taught analysis, all of these things that would go into an architect and would be useful for them to do their day job. Then somebody introduced me to the idea that was also from George Box, who was a British statistician. And it's a pretty interesting quote, and it's that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And that was the first sort of idea that says, ultimately, a model is an abstraction from a system or an idea or a process, but it isn't the system or the idea or the process. And that in the wild, it'll ultimately perform differently But models are like heuristics. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're reusable, sometimes they tell you what to do, sometimes they tell you what not to do. But if you can absorb this, it will tell you that, again, a model is an abstraction. It's a useful tool, but getting better models isn't actually going to lead you to a better reality. Eventually, I taught database design at Stanford for a couple of semesters. And one of the things that was true that was also just sort of fundamentally staring me in the face was this idea of query optimization. So most tools, query optimizers, exist on their own. I think there'll be some interesting conversations with people who've had experience with SAP over time, like, why is this slow? It's a query optimization problem, and you bring people in to help it get fast again. And one of the fascinating principles of query optimization is that any plan, any query plan, executing that query plan is faster than figuring out what the ideal query plan is, right? Turns out that you actually have to execute them all to be sure, because every one of them is based on a heuristic, and that heuristic is an internal model for what's going to happen with the database. And so all models are wrong, but some models are useful, and so we apply those successive models to our practices, and then realizing that more precision doesn't actually help. So at the end, I thought that I figured it out now. All right, so architecture is not about diagrams. Architecture is about outcomes. Now, this was not what I was taught in school. This was not what I was taught with TOGAF. I learned about artifacts and documentation and all of the good things that surrounded the act of architecture. I learned how to do those diagrams in various different domains and disciplines, how to break down a problem, how to do problem decomposition. And yet it took me years, the better part of a decade for what it's worth, from the mid-1990s to the mid to late 2000s to figure that architecture isn't about diagrams. It's about outcomes. So, all right, I've been an architect, did it for a decade, thought I knew everything. Now I know everything, right? So I have talked before about what it means to be an architect. Grant was kind enough to invite me to talk at the Chief Architect Network at one point. And Linda, yes, we met a few years ago again at one of those events. These are the sorts of things that I learned when I was an architect. And that's when, obviously, I knew everything. So the lessons there, first off, there's sort of this underlying principle that I finally picked up, is that models rarely survive contact with reality, okay? Is because that ultimately reality is a bit messier. It might be the difficulty in integration. It might be you've created a spec or an interface that's otherwise not achievable. It might be as simple as you get dirty data from a partner that puts your model to test. But one of the first lessons was that there was a difference between being right and being effective. This meant both as an architect, the act of architecture, and designing architectures themselves. That sometimes a good enough architecture that can be executed beats a perfect one that nobody can use, right? And so this was me saying I needed to step down from the ivory tower, that I actually needed to stop saying this is the perfect design and handing it to a team that said it's too hard, it's too esoteric, it's too different than what we understand, and that the good enough architecture was ultimately good enough, and that the being right and effective were different. And I could make an argument from a classroom perspective, from a scientist perspective, that this was the right answer, didn't mean it was the effective answer. And it took me a little while to figure that out. The second thing I learned was that trade-offs happen anyway. That the only question is whether or not somebody is actually steering them. And what I mean by that is sometimes we would go in and we would be faced with a problem and we would be asked to create a solution. It would be a discrete act of architecture. And we would go in and we would have we would have JAD and we would have ARB, we'd have joint architectural design sessions with our engineering partners. We would go through the motions and we would come up with a solution. What's fascinating about that is it might have solved the problem at the time, but we were in the process of making trade-offs whether we knew it or not, because the architecture we chose, the thing that we landed on, the thing that we co-designed and co-developed, had features And it had things that it optimized for and things that were de-optimized for. And understanding that you're making those trade-offs continuously was something that was pretty important, and that those trade-offs were happening. Even if you solved your problem, you put some other limitations into the system. The third thing, and this was very tactical, was the idea to favor two-way doors. And this was learned with battle scars. Very oftentimes we would start off with an idea, with an approach, and we would get far down the road and then figure out the real underlying complexity of the problem. And in doing so, that was oftentimes a limitation, that we could not back away from a solution. And if you failed in that direction a few times, or in that way a few times, you learn to find the two-way doors, learn to take the choices that can essentially be unmade. The fourth thing is that complexity accumulates by default, and that if no one owns it, it compounds quietly. And so a lot of times people have ways to characterize this. They talk about technical debt as having an interest rate, that if you don't address it, it gets worse over time because you're farther and farther out of spec, farther and farther from different. You have fewer and fewer people in an organization that know how, for example, to maintain a technology. I think of it almost like physics, like entropy, is that the universe tends towards chaos, and that left to its own devices, everything starts to crumble at the margins. And that might not be true if technology itself wasn't continuously moving, if vendor-supplied platforms weren't continuously moving forward, et cetera. Fifth one means neutrality means not falling in love with your own ideas, and that detachment creates credibility. I did have a little bit of a crisis of confidence at one point where I was told that I was too invested in my ideas. Kind of went back to the idea, the first one, that I was right about something. And I had a boss who said, listen, nobody wants to listen to you because you don't seem like you're unbiased. Even if you are, even if you're just advocating for the right answer, your job is to enumerate the choices, put them in front of the decision makers if it's not you, and then make that available. You're not supposed to be a cheerleader. You're not supposed to be a partisan. If you're going through and you're supporting an M&A activity, or you're supporting procurement, doing vendor analysis, or you're doing third-party risk assessment, and you look like you have an agenda, can't be trusted in your role. And so that was something that certainly was important. And then finally, practice successive refinement. That it's rare that all of the constraints and considerations are known perfectly up front. And because of that, you should start with a workable answer, something at the high level, and then improve it as your uncertainty shrinks. So it took me a long time. It took me a decade to learn these sort of 6 rules that reformed what I thought my job was. And so these lessons actually simplified what I thought the job was. And I thought, now, okay, I get it. It's the art of making decisions under constraints. There are constraints provided by budget. There are constraints provided by time. There are constraints provided by the existing environment. There are constraints provided by specifications or standards that we rely on. So this is clearly what the job is. Okay, so write it down. Definitely this. Because you guys didn't read the abstract before. I mean, obviously this must be the answer. Well, it was the answer. And if I were more amazing, I would be able to make like a record scratch noise. Pretend that was it. This idea for me stayed pretty consistent. And so as I practiced architecture, as I continued forward, even when I was working as a technical executive, the idea of the job, what it took to have the job, was pretty much the same. And it stayed the same until I didn't have the job anymore. And so later on, when I had architects working for me, but I was a technology executive, or when I was president at American Express and I had a CIO working for me and they had a chief architect working for them, all of a sudden, I realized that the things I thought I needed from the function, or that the function was supposed to deliver, weren't true. So we'll skip to the punchline, and then we'll go deeper into some of these areas a little bit. But what does architecture mean to business leaders? And I put this in the context of one. I will say I've spoken to some of my peers and some of my compatriots, and when I ask them what they need from architecture, and usually I lead the witness, and I say, do you need anything other than these two things? They're like, oh, that's pretty good. That's succinct. That is what I need from it. I think the first stark contrast, the first time I had this lesson, and I didn't realize it at the time, because as I mentioned before, I am definitely a slow learner. While I was at Yahoo, I got to talk to the board one time, right? And so this one time we were talking about pivoting the company, entering social as a space, how we were going to merge our identity systems, because our identity systems were hot garbage. That's a technical term. That the username you logged into Yahoo was also your handle for Yahoo Messenger, was also your email address. So the second you logged in and somebody saw you online, now you were open to spam and attacks and everything else. Like, there were real technical problems with the way the company operated. So I got one chance to talk to the board. And what was interesting about it was 90% of my slides, all of the models, all of the diagrams, everything, they said, well, if we have to, we'll put it in the appendix. But we're not even sure we want it there, because there's already a lot of stuff. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is what I do. This is, no. You're supposed to tell them what the problem is and tell them how we're thinking about changing the identity system. And the lesson was right there. I just didn't learn it at the time because I was still the architect. I was still the chief architect and needed to do things. So what does the business leader need? What are the pertinent lessons of those six? And I think there are two: managing complexity and guiding trade-offs. And I'll spend a few minutes here kind of hopefully making that case. For a lot of you, this is going to be pretty easy. It's going to be things that I think you probably know intuitively, or at least have been exposed to as ideas before. But the first one is that complexity is a cost when you're managing complexity. It's a financial cost because complex systems are difficult to change and difficult to maintain. It's an organizational cost. It's slow to collaborate. Who's familiar with Conway's Law? They kind of joke sometimes anecdotally to say that, the idea behind Conway's Law is if you have 3 teams working on a compiler, you'll have a 3-pass compiler. Now, what's funny is it's not about ownership and it's not about boundaries. Conway makes the argument that it's about communications and that it's easier for them not to communicate with each other and to work locally than it's not. So organizationally, complexity slows collaboration. It's risky. Complex systems break in unpredictable ways. Sometimes we think that's good. I don't know, I'm pretty good. See, complex system over there? Unpredictable ways, but it's very difficult to understand what's going to happen the more moving parts are and when something can't be held in somebody's head. Speaking of that, cognitively, it is hard to understand complex systems. If somebody here were to tell me they understand all of the systems, for example, set aside the business processes or the outcomes, but all of the systems at Best Buy, I'd say no way. Right? It's very, very difficult to do so, which means that we have to get overly specialized as we go. And ultimately, it's strategic. Complexity limits strategic options. So if you've brought strategic options into your domain of thinking, when you think about not only now, but the problems we're going to solve in the future, every time you pin something down and add some complexity into the environment, every time you add one more integration or fixate on one more standard, there's one other thing that you can't do. And so weirdly enough, we think sometimes of architecture as being a function that should enable strategy, but it's in tension with complexity, which disables it. So we know what the impacts are, right? We've all seen this. To our systems, we have duplicated platforms, 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 different ways to do the same thing at a company. Spaghetti integrations that are fragile, that have 10 different layers in the stack and 4 different partners along the way. That's difficult, and managing that complexity itself is difficult. From an operations perspective, we oftentimes have rising incident complexity. And what's the problem with incident complexity? Not talking about more incidents happening, but when complicated incidents happen, when you have to walk through a deep stack, for example, to do root cause analysis, it means your time to recover gets slower, it gets longer, that it's more difficult, and that ultimately the complexity itself, even if you're maintaining 2 nines or 3 nines or 4 nines, and your events are coming with no more frequency, oftentimes they're more impactful, or sometimes they show up in esoteric ways. And then finally, for people, it turns out complexity makes things difficult, oftentimes with unclear ownership. That complexity often shows up in chains of integration, in layers and stacks, and the things that we talk about as good things, as isolation of concerns, as segmentation of value, as good design, mean that we have different groups of people that own them. And so who owns the end-to-end outcome? Has anybody ever heard about that as a challenge? That is a challenge here, certainly, but it's been a challenge everywhere I've ever been. The last one, though, is onboarding friction. It's sometimes very hard to bring somebody into an environment that is very complicated, and it takes them time to get effective. So how do great architects respond to complexity? Standardize and simplify, right? That should be one of the goals. If you're faced with complexity, get rid of the variations in the system. Design for modularity, but do it intentionally. This is one of those lessons. Not everything should be modular. If you need to be fast and you're narrow, build a monolith. It's going to be great to have inter-process communication or in-memory. On the other hand, if you need to expand horizontally, don't build a monolith. And so design for modularity, but do so with intentionality. A great architect creates visibility as well. There are artifacts that come out of architecture that invite understanding from others because we don't ultimately do it for ourselves. We do it for the enterprise. And those are things like maps, data lineage, capability models, portfolio views, et cetera. But there are some types of visibility that come out of great architects. They don't just evaluate things once. A great architect continuously governs decisions, not just at initial designs, because environments change, operations change, requirements change, businesses change. And in our cases, as we've seen in the last couple of decades for sure, technology literally changes out from underneath us. And finally, and this is one of these things that's critically important, or is to me now in my new seat, is they make the consequences, the cost of complexity, visible in a language that executives understand, right? Doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you've ever been faced with a program like tech debt remediation, or you've wanted to clean up a system or whatever, and you've sort of put together a proposal or you've helped an engineering team do that, and they show up to the funding process, and now they're talking to people in like controllership or finance, and all of a sudden those projects aren't getting off the ground, but they seem like they have obvious value. They do, probably right. Your engineering partners are probably right, but it's not visible in a language that the executives can understand. And so the great architects are the ones who make that true, who can help the work drive forward. So at the end of the day, managing complexity, two things. First and foremost, your organization will become complex on its own, and it will only become manageable because of you. That is the maxim. That's only know two things. This is one of them. So the second thing, the second job I think architects have is guiding trade-offs. At the end of the day, everything in architecture is a trade-off. Every once in a while, you get this Pareto optimal possibility where you say, okay, I'm going to be better, faster, and cheaper simultaneously. That's usually a result of your last decision having been terrible, so you get to revisit it. But ultimately, everything in architecture is a trade-off. And optimization requires choosing what to optimize. And again, the trade-offs are there whether you acknowledge them or not. So classic trade-offs: performance versus scalability, simplicity versus flexibility, building that monolith versus that microservices architecture, security versus usability. We could have retinal scanners at the door, and it turns out that would probably be a little more secure than we are today, but it would definitely not make Best Buy store experience or headquarters feel more usable. Cost versus reliability, right? Maybe you have 3 nines and the business wants 4 nines. Okay, fantastic. It's good to want things, as I tell my children. But are you willing to pay the extra 60% to get there? And so that's the kind of trade-off there. And then consistency versus availability. And I put those two things there. We talk about like the CAP theorem in architectural design, consistency, availability, and partition. And remember, the CAP theorem isn't like the iron triangle in program management: good, fast, cheap, pick 2. The CAP theorem says that under conditions of partitioning, under P, you get to pick A or C. And so those decisions are critically important for anybody that runs a distributed system. And if you don't run a distributed system, yeehaw, more power to you. I don't know how you're getting reliability and BCP and HA and everything else, and you clearly aren't running on the cloud. And that's fine. I know those things exist, but for most of us, we've got to make those trade-offs, and we've got to make those trade-offs clear to the business. So the architects, though, here's the thing, and this was a lesson that took me a long time to understand, is they don't decide alone. It isn't their job to make the decision and be the advocate. Now, they may have a recommendation, that's true, but what does a great architect feel like to somebody from my seat in the business? They are somebody who frames the options, who makes it clear to say, look, if you've defined something in terms of a problem space, these are the 3 different solutions for the problem. They frame those options. They then surface the consequences. They say this is what it means to take path A, path B, or path C. And they do so in a way that links those choices explicitly to the business priorities, to the things that the person in my seat cares about, i.e., it might be a time when time to market is super important because a competitor has just scooped us on something. Or it might be a time when we're optimizing, so total cost of ownership is the most important thing from a budget perspective. Or future-proofing, or getting out from under meaningful tech debt. These are all things that are important to be able to make clear and to link to the business. And then finally, ensure that the organization makes intentional decisions. And I don't mean make a choice. When I say intentional decisions, I mean make that choice with the full awareness of those first 3 things so that we know what it means. And that prevents a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking and coming back later to say, hey, listen, why am I stuck with X? We just spent $100 million to re-platform and get off the mainframe, and now you're telling me it still takes a year to release our app? What happened? And if you've done those things at the top, certainly for a technical architect, it makes much more sense because the business knows what it's signing up for. So, punchline for this one, guiding trade-offs. Architects are not diagram creators. Except I was taught that architects are diagram creators. So it took a little bit of time to realize that the job was actually decision enablers, helping the business do the right thing. And so as we close, I actually thought about how I wanted to conclude, and I decided I was going to go for 3 different conclusions. The first one is how the 2 jobs of an architect feel to a business leader, to somebody in that seat. Second one is a cheat sheet for architects when they want to check in, are they doing these 2 things? And the final one is the thing if I could go back in time and tell my younger self a little bit of something, how I would formulate this to set myself on the right path. So managing complexity and guiding trade-offs when it's done well, how does it feel to the business? First and foremost, it should reduce risk without slowing the business down. That's one of the things that you're going to hear constantly, and not just from your compliance or your governance people, that it's about execution risk. Can we get the job done? That these are guardrails that help teams move faster. Make complexity legible. Make it visible. I'm not saying make it go away, but help me understand it as a business leader and help me understand the consequences. What is the fragility of the system and what does it cost? Either ongoing cost or cost to remediate. Frame the decisions in business terms. An architect that's doing things excellently, as we mentioned before, talks about options, they talk about costs, they talk about risk, they talk about ROI. They don't just need the patterns and diagrams. And very often, that lesson that came all the way back from Yahoo, where all of my material was relegated to the appendix, it turns out that wasn't in the language of the business, it wasn't in the language of the board. And that's one of those things that distinguishes an excellent architect. Keep the horizon balanced. Today's delivery and tomorrow's adaptability are oftentimes trade-offs that need to be made with one another. People sometimes call them one-offs or quick and dirty type projects, that those things are fine, but they have implications and surface those implications to the business. They will help create alignment across teams, that when you have a shared language, shared priorities, and things are transparent, there are very few surprises. And finally, the thing that it feels best in the business is that architects will have to say no sparingly, but credibly. And that when you say no, everybody understands why, because they're with you on the journey. So how do I tell my architects to check in? Conclusion number 2, what do I advise them to do? First and foremost, on every initiative, ask where the complexity is creeping in. Ask what the carrying cost of that incremental complexity will be going forward. Make every decision, especially when you document that decision, make the trade-offs explicit. So say, here are the options we have considered. Here are the things that we pruned early. Here's our final decision and what it means. What are we getting and what are we giving up versus the alternatives? Create a single artifact that makes the landscape visible to leadership. Oftentimes we will have those models or those diagrams, the things that are important for us, that are consumable by us, or maybe our partners in engineering, or maybe for a little better, some of our partners in product. But if you can make it visible, whether it's a roadmap or a tech portfolio, a placemat design, do so, and that'll be super important. Document the decisions with why, not just the what. And again, the number of times I've seen a decision made that says, hey, these were the 2 alternatives, we went with A, and the history of that decision is cauterized, is staggering. And then finally, as I mentioned before, revisit assumptions every so often, because priorities do change. I have it baked into a little mantra, because I led architects for a long time, even after not having the job. And the idea is, manage complexity, guide trade-offs, and align to business value. And if they're doing those things continuously, then they will be as successful as they possibly can be. And then finally, last but not least, what would I tell my younger self? If I went all the way back to the very beginning of this talk and I was starting out on my journey, and I was there in school in a computer science class, and then being introduced to architecture, and then senior design, and then through all of those degrees, I'd say this one thing. I would say architecture isn't about getting models right. It's about helping organizations move faster with fewer regrets, and you achieve that by managing complexity and guiding trade-offs. And I think if I had that time machine and I could go all the way back in time, I would be able to unlearn the things that came in the classroom much sooner and would have been quite a bit more effective. But with that, that is my punchline. That's what I wanted to leave you guys with today. Obviously, thank you to everyone who could make it here. Thank you for Linda for putting this together. And we have a few minutes for questions before lunch.
We certainly do. So awesome. I mean, I was just thinking the whole time you were talking, Neal, we're going to run around Phil Donahue style, if anyone remembers that. The thing about Neal, well, what I was going to say is there are 2 kinds of, I'm delighted when I listen to 2 kinds of speakers. The ones that I nod my head the whole time and go, he's right about everything.
Can you call
but
my
what's
mom
interesting
after
is
this?
I started on the business side. I do not have a PhD in anything to do with technology. So I actually did learn architecture in the streets.
Nice.
But
got a tattoo to prove
but
it.
look
By
at
the
the
way.
yeah. Yeah. Chains and but the meeting in the middle after all these years of working in this and recognizing that everything he said is true. And I'm sure that I'll probably yammer on about all that for 3 days. But Excellent, wonderful. The other speaker that I love is the one I don't agree with, because I go, let's talk about this in the streets, right? Anyway, so we're going to do a couple of questions. Who has a question? We got one right here. And Lori and I are going to run around and make this. Lori, I see that your mic's not on. Maybe you want to get that on. Oh, Neal, you're next after Scott.
Neal, great presentation. Question for you. I think as someone who has grown up more on the sort of sciencey technology side of things, I think one of the more interesting things for me is business leaders tend not to be rational actors sometimes.
Yeah.
And so how do you deal with that dynamic in the mix in a trade-off situation or something like that, where there's politics or something that would be maybe more in the irrational sense in the equation, and you've got to deal with it?
Yeah. So I had the pleasure of working at eBay for a little while. And one of the things that working in that company taught me was this notion of a transfer function. And eBay had a mechanical way to de-rationalize, to take away the passion, I should say, from decisions. And the transfer function was the idea that you turned everything into a common currency. Maybe it's dollars, maybe you're worried about improving NPS and a customer experience, that sort of thing. And so what we tended to do, and I'll go back to a model or a framework, is when we're coming forward with those decisions, you've got something like LAM, the Lightweight Alternative Architectural Assessment Method, or a Pew matrix, or Excel, where you actually enumerate the things that are important to us. Here are the 5 different attributes that we want to optimize for. Here are their relative weights, and here's how we think the various solutions perform. And so I think the thing that's been successful for me is to take those irrational concerns and sort of put them into a rational framework and put them into something that makes them explicit. You could say an aversion to working with a startup is either rational or irrational, right? Because it's somebody saying, I'd rather trade with a big company, I'd rather take less risk on a partner. That's neither rational nor irrational. It's just the thing that they feel. And so let's put that into the framework. Let's figure out how we can say whether or not they are an ongoing concern, right? Or we're worried about their viability as a partner. You can take that sort of thing that's a feeling or a gut feel and put it right in there. So I do think there are mechanisms that we have access to that allow us to put those concerns into a framework. Brand risk is one that I always struggled with early on, because I was like, I don't even know what brand has to do with technology. And yet that's an element that oftentimes gets incorporated into those frameworks, because I have a partner who's worried about what if things go wrong. And that's balanced by execution risk, meaning one type of risk creates another type of risk. But I think you can put those things into frameworks. I really do. You just have to be explicit about enumerating it, pulling out of your partners what's most important, and then putting that in and turning the crank.
Hi, Neal. I couldn't agree with Linda more. I was nodding my head all throughout your presentation. And I'm trying to remember the advice to your younger self about what architecture is around focusing on the trade-offs and giving advice. But as we are building the next generation of architects, do we forget all the frameworks, or do we need to reinvent the frameworks, or how do we grow the next generation? Is it even possible without knowing all the science to come to the conclusions you came to?
I would go all the way back to what George said. All models are wrong, but some are useful. I think all of the frameworks have some level of utility for them. I did learn a lot from TOGAF. I'm not saying that wasn't useful time spent or modeling in ER diagrams, but the knowing when to use them and in which domains and to what degree, that's really the distinction. So I would tell you, if you can learn 15 different frameworks, you're going to be better off than if you only know 10, but you use those 10 90% of the time. It's like having another tool in the toolbox. The more tools you have and the more diversity of tools, the more problems you'll be able to assess. So I'm not saying we should throw them away. I'm saying we shouldn't treat them as inviolate, and we should recognize that they have intrinsic limitations to them, and that the act of architecture isn't fulfilling the framework. It's not presenting something that is pure to TOGAF. It's presenting something that helps the business create its most value. And so I don't think you have to abandon the frameworks. I just think you need to set them as subordinate to the business outcome. And what you need to accomplish, by the way, with your framework, in my opinion, is you need to tame complexity and you need to help the business make decisions. And if the framework helps with that, fantastic. And if it doesn't, you can find a different framework, right? So.
Hey, Neal, how you doing? Again, I'll third what Linda and Neal said. I was nodding my head the whole time as well. So thank you so much for coming here and giving us.
But you were sleepy, right? You're like,
No, well, it's however it's more up for interpretation, I guess, right? But no, I'm just kidding. I think so. Working for a vendor like SAP, and I want to know, kind of coming across your experience. Obviously, you have the sales side of the ball, right? When it comes to working with your internal VAT team. So, what would be some advice for younger architects you could give us when it comes to how we need to operate as architects and helping the business get to where they need to be, but also not stepping on the toes of the sales cycles and the people that are in that kind of ballpark? Because I want to make sure with how we operate at SAP internally, we're very we want to let people do their job and not get too involved on sides of things that are obviously not within the architect's purview. So what would be the advice to kind of balance that effort from an architect perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge that I don't necessarily know the answer to, except when it comes to SAP. So, it's funny. At Walgreens, we actually had the largest retail instance of SAP in the world. And for better or worse, we actually built it on S/4HANA, that we were one of the first vertically scaled instances. We ran on multiple nodes because we were that big, and each node had 32 terabytes of memory, of RAM, terabytes, not gigabytes, not megabytes, and the workload barely fit. And the tension that's there in that type of situation, the tension that's there with a commercial product coming into an organization, is that architecture is best served sort of speaking truth to power, doing all of those things, being clear, talking through consequences, talking through limitations, talking through complexity. Sales is the opposite of those things. So, it's all things to all people. It slices, it dices, it chops. It can be a paperweight. It cannot be a paperweight just as well. And so they'll also promise things that are coming as opposed to things that are. And architecture should be enumerating the risks of real consequence that are on the things that are. And so I don't know how to fix that particular gap, because that is one that if you are coming from the outside and you are serving as a solutions architect or a technical architect or a consulting architect with a business doing an implementation, and you have a sales partner over here, I think you guys are measured in different ways. And so that you'll have to wait till you have this much wisdom in your beard and you can come give that talk to the rest of us. Because that's when I will tell you, when you're measured on different things and you have different outcomes, it's very, very hard to synthesize. So it doesn't mean you don't work together and do sales support and all that kind of stuff, but it's a challenge.
But I will say that's why we have a track called Business Transformation and Architecture with SAP, because you have this challenge. You have to focus on business outcomes. And as someone who is managing, to Neal's same experience, managing the tension between anyone, your company, another company, trying to sell stuff, and then you will feel bad when none of that stuff works later. And you may be actually punished for that when none of that stuff, you certainly won't sell any more stuff, right? So recognize your helpers. Your helpers are architects. This is where I think we need to mature and evolve to. And then, of course, your leaders, some of whom are in the room right now, recognizing the importance of that codependency and honoring and making room for those conversations to start. So when they sell something, they maybe give you a call and say, hey, I'm doing this. Or you have the organizational operating model that says, yeah, no, there's a relationship here, because your customer is not going to be happy when this stuff doesn't work. And it's not going to work unless there's some kind of perspective on the architectural fit of it. So this is maturity 101, but also the hardest thing, right? So they want to sell, you want to make sure that it fits. The bad day when none of the outcomes come where they need to be, it's all of our fault. But if we didn't have that opportunity, if we didn't find and make that opportunity to connect it up, to get to know each other, to whatever, call the person and say, listen, I'm the architect on that thing. I know you just sold that. Can we talk? We got to start owning this stuff because it's just not going to happen. And I know Ranjit specifically, Jason Porterfield, there are people here that are acknowledging this problem. But the fact is you won't sell any more stuff when none of it works, right? And that's why outcomes are, we got to be the mature people that see, there are things we can do here to help. And that's so, sorry, Neal, to jump in there, but I think we said the same thing. You have to reconcile that. We have to reconcile that. And anyway, there you go. But we'll have one more question. By the way, throughout this whole 3 days, we have lunch is ready, but value is value. So we're going to stay with Neal a little bit longer because you got plenty of time for lunch. What did you say?
I said I'm in the way of lunch. Ooh.
Oh, well, no, you're not in the way of anything. But so anyway, you're going to see it flow that way. We might not be as rigorous to the schedule as we are to the value that we're getting. So Charlie, question from Charlie, and then maybe we'll take one more, maybe we won't. Let's see how long this one is.
Make it green. Got it. Okay. Charlie Best, Forrester Research. You mentioned tech debt. Last year, and I lead the EA coverage, and tech debt spiked last year in terms of the frequency and the urgency and the seniority of the conversations. So I am researching the executive storytelling problem. What are effective strategies and messages? You mentioned some things that weren't working, but what does work when you're trying to make the case to the CFO, the controller, et cetera?
Yeah, a couple of things. First and foremost, I'll go back to the idea of making the constraints or concerns legible or understandable to the business. So put it in terms that they understand. I think tech debt as an analogy is a pretty good one, but you need to go a little bit farther than that and say, not all debt is bad. It's just like having a mortgage to get a house, right? You take on the debt, it's manageable, and you get an asset out of it. Some debt is really bad. You've got a credit card that's got a 30% APR. You shouldn't be revolving on that. And so having a more nuanced discussion at the next level in the language that the executive team understands is super important, because then they understand that you know the difference, that it's not everything is the same. Woe is me. Platforms are burning. We've got to fix everything. Because their counter to that is, well, you're building gold-plated IT, right? Or whatever. And so getting deeper into their language, not just at the surface level, saying not only is it debt, but we recognize there are different types of debt. We should take a portfolio approach to it. Some debt is good, I find opens a door to having a conversation that's really productive because it's in their language. The second thing, though, and normally I don't appeal to the outside, but I would say, having been at a couple of companies with some significant tech debt, getting outside consulting that knows exactly how to deal with it, that's what they do for a living, has been super important. That having someone come in and size the debt and put it, they naturally will understand the language of business because that's how they do their work as consultants. They will know how to measure it. Is millions of lines of code an indicator of power, success, capability, or too much complexity and debt? Don't know, but oftentimes those consultants will have tools to do that type of analysis. They will know the cost of remediation on the open market if you want to bring other folks in. And so I think because it's not something we do all the time and is oftentimes episodic and is sort of spiking now, I think it's okay to ask for some help. Bring in some folks who have some experience that for a living do tech debt remediation at scale. That's very different than, hey, I've got a database that's 3 revs behind and it needs to be upgraded, or we need to retire a different technology. But for a portfolio approach, it's not the work that we're optimized for. So getting some help, and then of course speaking the language of the business, that's how I found to be most successful in looking at those big remediation programs.
Okay, we are, anyone have any burning 2-minute thing? No? Okay. First of all, huge round of applause for this man. Here, I wrote you a card.
Is it a Best Buy gift certificate?
No. But I did just buy a couple of computers from Best Buy just for my, for TCBF. So, yeah.
Nice.
Anyway, okay. So, Neal, thank you. It just couldn't be more important to us that you're here. We're going to go out to Sandy's place to lunch. If you don't have one of these, this is your at a glance. This tells you the time stuff is happening. As I said, we're kind of going, the clock is the clock. Be at the new place at the time it starts. If the prior thing ends earlier, later, whatever, do what you're doing. But be at the new place if you want to get the new info or start the new track. Sandy's place for lunch. There's a reception, a mixer at the very end of today that will be in the same location that is just getting to know our partners, our ecosystem, the people that we're going to be hearing from immediately prior to ending. So go there. And then tomorrow, if you haven't heard about this yet, which I would be surprised, but I shouldn't be. We are hosting an event for everyone at the conference at the Westin Galleria Hotel, which is our little reception. We have it every year. I call it's a holiday reception. It still qualifies for New Year's, right? So, but that will be happening tomorrow night or tomorrow right after the conference. So make sure that you don't pass that up because it'll be fun. And we'll be talking more, but you'll be back in this room after a couple of sessions, straight from lunch over to the tracks. Okay, everyone good? Find someone. Don't hesitate to approach anyone and ask any question. That's your job these 3 days. Okay, thanks a million.